Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's Reddit Quickie, taken from the subreddit HFY, called Post-Emptive Strike, written by Communist Red. The link to the original will be down below, and as always, I hope that you enjoy. Okay class, that's it for this section. The section exam will be held during our second lecture hour next week, so be prepared. Come and see me during office hours if you have any questions. We've got a little time left, so I'm going to close off this chapter with a little anecdote that I enjoy telling, even though it's pretty horrifying. It's the usual transition into the next period of history that we will be looking at. It won't be on the exam, so no need to take notes. It's about the humans of the home planet of Earth. No, I don't expect you have heard of them. There's not many of them around these days. At the end of the Third Galactic Era, the humans had recently joined the Galactic Council as a sub-member. They had barely achieved faster-than-light travel. They had a couple extrasolar colonies, fairly standard for a Class 3 culture. Unfortunately, they were right at the edge of the Estacion space. The Estacion Empire was one of ascendancy at the time, becoming a major player on the galactic scene. As we have seen happen time and time again throughout the Third Era of such communities, the Estacion Empire saw the potential as cheap labor, free real estate and resources to be pillaged. They drummed up a couple false and exaggerated charges of encroachment on their territory and began to make moves of war. The humans of course begged for the intercession of the Council, which was ignored as usual. I won't go into the detail about the human-estacion war, as it went exactly how you would expect. A mere 13 hours after declaration of war on Earth, the humans had capitulated. Most of the defense systems hadn't even been able to engage the Estacion fleet, and those that did were simply unmade. 60% of humanity were dead, incapacitated, or directly enslaved as a result of the war, and the remainder dispersed throughout the galaxy or lived as subspecies on their own worlds. Life went on. But 1 year later, a dead zone, that is a region of space that cannot be passed through, was recorded near Earth by several merchant corporations. These crop up pretty commonly as a result of space debris, pirate space-time anomalies, and so on, so no one paid it any mind except to avoid it. Gradually, it moved away from Earth and towards the Estacia Prime, until 184 years after they had been defeated, when an unusually persistent dead zone, gradually becoming more of a nuisance and entering their solar system, Estacia finally investigated the root cause of the dead zone. It left them just 7 hours to evacuate the planet before the first projectile struck. Hundreds of thousands of steel rods accelerated to a considerable fraction of the speed of light, pulverizing the surface of Estacia. First one side, then, as the planet turned, the other. The bombardment was practically fierce for 13 hours, then regular for the next 3 days, but they continued to fall for some time afterwards, with the last known projectile striking some 3 weeks after the very first. The rods ranged from being roughly my size and small end, with a big size at the large tree. Some of the inhabitants had managed to escape the planet, and a large percentage of the rest had managed to find shelter in underground bunkers. Nonetheless, analysts believe that a good third of the population of Estacia were still on the surface. So few of these survived that the number could be considered a rounding error. Those had made it to the shelter underground fared better, but it's estimated that nearly half of the bunkers were compromised, and at least some inside were wounded or killed. Galactic aid was on the scene in a few hours, but was forced to wait for the bombardment to subside. When the first aid ships landed, they had to dig desperately through what was since been called the 4 layers of Estacia, meters of dust, steel, concrete, and corpses, to try and find and rescue those still trapped inside the bunkers. Many bunkers were found, and the survivors taken to safety. Others were lost under the debris and only found months or even years later. I'll leave it to your imagination what happened to those who had sought shelter inside them. Only half the population of Estacia survived the catastrophe. Obviously, investigations into who had fired the projectiles began and found that they had originated from human space 184 years ago. The human used railguns on their fleet and orbital defenses, which accelerated the mass to significant speeds. Somehow, these projectiles had been modified to be less detectable. They had calculated where Asteria Prime would be in the future with an unnerving precision, fired the projectiles, and artificially accelerated them beyond the speeds typically used in kinetic warfare. It's believed that every single one of the human space-based railguns not actively engaging the Estacian fleet on ships or platforms fired every projectile it could in the 13 hours before the human surrender. The result was what came to be known as the Steel Rains of Estacia. The Estacians demanded punishment and reparations, but there were few issues with that, largely because there was no one left to seek reparations from. The humans had effectively ceased to exist as an organized body after the war. In fact, by Estacian law, they were now part of the Estacian Empire, and therefore the Empire would have to pay for their own reparations. They tried to hunt down the perpetrators, but none of the people who had fired the shots or commanded one fire were alive to blame. What was shocking was that none of those who had been responsible had passed that knowledge on. Almost to a man, the remaining humans were as shocked as the rest of the Galactic community. They had fired everything that they had for those 13 hours straight, and then simply never told us all. Whether for revenge or just out of hopelessness, we'll never know. Finally, those humans who were still leadership positions argued that this was just simply an act of all-out war. The Estacians had started the war and threw everything that they had at humanity. The humans had simply returned the favor as best that they could. Who could blame them for taking such long for their weapons to hit their target? To cut a long story short, the Estacian Empire lost a lot of sway in the Galactic community, and their ascendancy was cut short, never to rise again. The peers saw them as essentially losing a tiny backwater community, and they had more pity than respect from the Galactic Council for quite some time. But more importantly, this resonated deeply within a species and planets that had suffered the same treatment as Earth. Across the galaxy, slaves and subjects began to fight for equality, autonomy, and rights from the great powers at the time. The Estacian incident had shown them that, even in defeat, they could strike a blow to the oppressors. Slogans like "In death we conquer," often accompanied by the images of a human skeleton wearing a crown or holding a flag, became commonplace in these movements. And the end result was one of the most widespread and bloody revolutions in history and the desolation or collapse of 3 of the 5 great galactic powers of the time, eventually leading to the restructuring of the Galactic Council. Out of the bloody ashes of Estacia came a significant set of reforms and the beginning of the 4th Galactic Era, generally regarded as the golden age of the galaxy, with significant improvements in equality and the average standard of living. So, for those of you who are worried about your grades after the last dismissal test results, I'd encourage you to be inspired by the humans, who managed to win a war even 200 years after they had already lost it. There may be hope for you yet. Thank you, and that will be all. See you next week. And that, my friends, is the end of this Reddit Quickie. I hope that you enjoyed. If you'd like to support this channel, there are numerous ways to do so, listed in the description down below. The easiest and best way would be to share this video and my channel as much as possible. I'll see you all in the next video, and I hope that you have a good one until then. Cheers.